A single word sparked a war that burned for 20 years. That word was heresy, and the conflict was the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal campaign that tore apart the soul of southern France. This was far more than a simple religious dispute. It was a pivotal struggle where the absolute power of the medieval Catholic Church clashed with a rival faith known as Catharism. The lush lands of Languedoc became a battleground for souls, but also for political control, with northern lords and the French crown seeing a golden opportunity for conquest. The full story is a tapestry of deep mystery and enduring controversy, filled with questions that still haunt us. Why did a pope sanction such violence against fellow Christians? How did a peaceful religious movement provoke a genocide? By the end of this journey, through 25 critical moments, you will understand how this forgotten war secretly forged the map of modern Europe. What does it truly take to erase a belief from the world? The heart of this conflict beats with a profound and radical idea. In the sun-drenched lands of southern France, a faith had taken root that saw the universe in a stark division of light and darkness. This was Catharism. Its followers, known as the Cathars or the Albigensians, were not merely protesting church corruption. They were proposing an entirely different reality. Their belief was dualist, meaning they saw two fundamental powers at war. The spiritual world was the creation of a good and pure God, but the physical world, they taught, was the flawed creation of a lesser, evil God. This was the God of the Old Testament, a deity of wrath and matter. In this view, everything you could touch, see, or feel, including your own body, was part of a corrupt and temporary prison. The ultimate goal of life was to escape this material coil and return to the realm of pure spirit. Can you see how this belief would shatter the very foundations of medieval Catholicism? The Church taught that God had created the material world and called it good. Most critically, it taught the doctrine of the Incarnation, that God Himself had taken on human flesh in the form of Jesus Christ. For the Cathars, this was impossible. A good God would never imprison Himself in evil matter. To them, Jesus was a purely spiritual being, an angel who only appeared to have a physical body. This belief made the Church's most sacred rituals, its sacraments, meaningless. If matter was evil, then baptism with water, or the Eucharist with bread and wine, could not be channels of divine grace. They were empty ceremonies using corrupt substances. This was not just a theological disagreement, it was a direct challenge to the Church's authority and its very reason for existing. So why did this radical faith flourish so powerfully in the Languedoc? The answer lies in the unique character of the region itself. Southern France in the 12th century was a land of vibrant cities, prosperous trade, and a thriving culture of poetry and courtly love. Its nobles, like the powerful Count of Toulouse, were fiercely independent, often resisting the influence of the northern French king. They valued their autonomy and were tolerant of the diverse religious ideas circulating in their domains. Early church missions, sent to debate the Cathars and win them back through persuasion, failed completely. The Cathar perfecti, their spiritual elite, were admired for their austere lives of poverty and piety, standing in stark contrast to the often wealthy and worldly Catholic clergy. By the dawn of the 13th century, Catharism was not a fringe sect. It was deeply woven into the social fabric, protected by local lords and followed by a significant portion of the population, from weavers and merchants to knights and noblewomen. Its strongholds were not just ideas, but actual stone castles perched high on rugged mountain peaks, visible symbols of a faith that had dug in for the long term. The stage was set not for a debate, but for a collision. Into this simmering tension stepped a man of unyielding conviction. Pope Innocent III appointed a Cistercian monk named Pierre de Castelnau as his special legate, granting him immense authority to resolve the Cathar problem. Castelnau's mission was one of final persuasion. He was to travel throughout the Languedoc, debate the Cathar perfecti, and convince the local nobility to withdraw their protection from the heretics. His goal was eradication, but his initial methods were intended to be peaceful, relying on the power of argument and the threat of spiritual consequences. Yet Castelnau, a man steeped in the strict, black and white worldview of his order, quickly found himself mired in a world of political grays. His primary obstacle was not the Cathar faithful themselves, but the most powerful lord in the south, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. Raymond was a master of political ambiguity. He was a Catholic who found it useful to tolerate the Cathars, perhaps even sympathizing with some of their critiques of the Church. He represented the old Southern way of life, where faith was a personal matter and lordship was about practical alliances, not doctrinal purity. To Castelnau, this tolerance was not pragmatism. It was complicity. He saw Raymond as a vacillating and dishonest figure, a man who would publicly swear oaths to oppose heresy while privately allowing it to flourish under his very nose. Each meeting between the stern legate and the evasive count deepened the mistrust. Castelnau's frustration grew with every broken promise and every excuse Raymond offered for his inaction. The breaking point came at a final, tense confrontation. After yet another failed negotiation, Pierre de Castelnau invoked the Church's ultimate weapon. He publicly excommunicated Count Raymond VI, casting him out of the Catholic community and declaring his soul in mortal peril. This was not merely a spiritual censure. In the 13th century, excommunication was a devastating political act. It dissolved the oaths of loyalty Raymond's vassals had sworn to him and freed them from their obligations. It was a declaration of war by other means. That single act of spiritual judgment shattered any remaining hope for a peaceful settlement. The rift between the Church and the most powerful secular authority in the Languedoc was now formal, public, and irreparable. The path of dialogue was closed, leaving only one road open. The murder happened on a riverbank in January of the year 1208, as Pierre de Castelnau prepared to cross the Rhône. A knight in the service of Count Raymond VI rode forward and drove a lance into the papal legate. The assassin fled, leaving the churchman dying on the ground. This was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted killing of the Pope's own representative, and its shockwaves would forever change the course of European history. In the immediate aftermath, one question burned in everyone's mind. Did Count Raymond order the hit? The knight who wielded the weapon was unquestionably one of his men, a clear link that tied the crime directly to the Count's court. Raymond himself protested his innocence, claiming the act was that of a lone, overzealous retainer. But the timing was deeply suspicious, coming so soon after Castelnau had humiliated the Count with excommunication. Was it a direct command from a furious ruler, or merely the predictable outcome of whipping up hatred against a man he refused to control? The truth of Raymond's personal guilt remains a historical mystery, but in the court of public opinion, and more importantly in the mind of the Pope, he was guilty. When news reached Rome, Pope Innocent III's reaction was one of pure, unbridled fury. He did not see this as a simple political assassination. He interpreted it through the most profound theological lens possible. To kill a papal legate, a man acting with the full authority of St. Peter, was akin to killing God's own representative on earth. In the Pope's eyes, this was not just murder. It was deicide. The people of the Languedoc were no longer merely heretics tolerating a rival faith. They had become God-killers, and their protector, Count Raymond, was a modern-day Judas. This single act became the final justification for total war. The Pope's call for a crusade was swift and thunderous. He offered a plenary indulgence, a full remission of sins, to any knight who would take up the cross and march against the heretics of the south. This was the very same spiritual reward promised to those who braved the long and perilous journey to fight for Jerusalem. With that one decree, Pope Innocent transformed a regional conflict into an international holy war. He was no longer just summoning French lords. He was inviting the entire warrior aristocracy of Christendom to save their souls by spilling southern blood. The target was no longer a foreign land of Muslims, but a part of France itself, filled with fellow Christians. How far would these crusaders go when their enemy lived in castles that looked just like their own, and when their prize was not a distant holy city, but the rich, coveted lands right next door? The Pope's call to arms was etched into a formal decree, a document known as a papal bull. Its words were not a request, but a divine command, and its language was crafted to ignite a fire. Pope Innocent III framed the coming violence as a sacred duty, a necessary surgery to cut a cancerous heresy from the body of Christendom itself. He painted the lands of the Languedoc as a spiritual infection zone, a place where the very soul of Christianity was under mortal threat from within. This was not a war of conquest, the bull insisted, but an act of purification, a holy cleansing that every faithful Christian was obligated to support. To make this duty irresistible, the Pope offered a package of rewards that appealed to both the conscience and the wallet. He promised a full remission of all sins, a spiritual clean slate for any knight who took the cross. This was the ultimate prize, freeing a man from the fear of hellfire, but there were also very earthly incentives. He offered the cancellation of all debts to moneylenders, a powerful lure for knights burdened by loans. Most tellingly, he granted the right to seize and keep the lands of any lord convicted of heresy. With that single clause, the crusade was transformed. It became a sanctioned land grab, a chance for landless younger sons and ambitious northern barons to win estates and titles in the famously wealthy south. The response was overwhelming. Across northern France, a massive army began to muster. Great lords and thousands of knights gathered under the Crusader banner, their motivations a tangled mix of genuine religious fervor and naked opportunism. They saw a target that was both spiritually condemned and materially rich, a combination that proved impossible to resist. Picture the scene in the spring of 1209. Fields normally used for farming were now temporary cities of tents, filled with the sounds of armorers at work and the sight of priests blessing grim-faced soldiers. This was not an army heading for a distant desert. It was a force assembling on the border of a neighbor, preparing to march into a region whose cities and castles were rumored to be overflowing with gold and silk. They were answering a holy call, but they were also marching toward the greatest payday of their lives. How would this war machine, built on a foundation of faith and greed, behave when it finally crashed into the sun-baked valleys of Languedoc? The Crusader army descended on the city of Béziers like a summer storm. The city was a formidable target, its walls strong and its population a mixture of loyal Catholics and the Cathars the Crusaders had come to punish. The leader of this holy war was not a king or a general, but the papal legate Arnaud de Mauric, a Cistercian abbot who now commanded a vast military force. He demanded the city hand over the 200 or so known Cathar heretics living within its walls. The citizens of Béziers, united in defiance, refused to betray their neighbors. In their refusal, they sealed a terrible fate. A chaotic skirmish broke out between the townsfolk and the Crusaders, and in the confusion, the Crusader army surged through an undefended gate. The city was overrun. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. The Crusaders gave no quarter. They moved through the streets, killing everyone they found. Thousands of people, men, women, children, Catholic and Cathar alike, were cut down or burned alive as they sought refuge in the city's main church. It was here that one of history's most chilling statements was born. The chroniclers reported that when a soldier asked the legate Arnaud de Mauric how to tell a heretic from a faithful Catholic, his reply was, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether Abbot Arnaud actually spoke those exact words is debated by scholars, but the phrase perfectly captured the Crusaders' terrifying new doctrine. This was total war, a holy war where spiritual purity justified the physical annihilation of an entire community. The death of a few hundred heretics was not enough. The very soil that nurtured them had to be cleansed with blood. The message of Béziers was calculated and brutal. It traveled faster than any herald, reaching every castle and town in Languedoc. The Crusaders were not there to debate or to distinguish. They were there to obliterate. The old rules of warfare, of ransoms and negotiated surrenders, were void. Your faith, your innocence, your local lord's loyalty, none of it mattered if you stood behind the wrong walls. The only path to survival was immediate and total surrender. How could any city, any lord, hope to stand against an enemy who saw the entire population as expendable? 2 weeks after the smoke cleared over Béziers, the Crusader army appeared before the formidable walls of Carcassonne. This city was the true prize, the heart of the Trinqueval lands and a place rumored to be nearly impregnable. Its double ring of massive stone walls and stout towers rose from the banks of the Aude River, a daunting sight for any attacker. Inside, the city was swollen with refugees from the surrounding countryside, all of whom had heard the grim story of Béziers and now looked to Carcassonne as their final sanctuary. The Crusaders, led by the papal legate, knew a direct assault would be a bloody and likely futile endeavor. Instead, they settled in for a siege, cutting off the city's access to fresh water and supplies, hoping to starve its defenders into submission. The summer heat was relentless, and within the crowded walls, conditions quickly became unbearable. Disease began to spread through the population, and the hope that had once filled the city started to curdle into desperation. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that the young Viscount Raymond Roger Trinqueval made a fateful decision. Believing in the chivalric codes of negotiation, he boldly walked into the Crusader camp under a flag of truce to plead for terms for his people. It was a brave, perhaps naive, act of leadership, but the rules of war had changed at Béziers. The moment he entered the enemy camp, the Viscount was seized and thrown into chains, a prisoner in violation of the very truce he had come to discuss. With their leader captured, the spirit of Carcassonne broke. The city surrendered, not to a final bloody sack, but to a grim and total defeat. The citizens were spared massacre, but were forced to leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs, exiled into an uncertain future. As for Viscount Trinqueval, his story ended just as abruptly. He died a few months later in his own dungeon, a captive in his former home. The official cause was dysentery, but many whispered of poison, a convenient end for a lord whose lands were now up for grabs. With Carcassonne secured, the Crusader leadership faced a crucial question. Who would now rule these conquered territories? They needed a leader, a man of both military grit and political ambition to hold the south for the crusade. Their choice fell upon a northern baron named Simon de Montfort. He was a respected and ruthless commander, a man utterly convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The appointment seemed like a simple administrative decision at the time, but it was a choice that would cast a long and bloody shadow. Simon de Montfort was not just a temporary general. He was now the Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, a prince of holy war with a personal stake in the conquest. How would this single-minded man, given a kingdom carved from the lands of others, manage to secure his new and deeply hostile domain? The man chosen to inherit the Trinqueval lands was a stranger to the south. Simon de Montfort was a northern baron from the Isle de France, a region of deep forests and unwavering loyalty to the French crown. He was not the wealthiest or most powerful lord in the Crusader host, but he possessed a unique combination of traits that made him the perfect candidate. He was a soldier of proven skill and unshakable piety, a man who saw the world in the stark contrast of good and evil, with no room for the nuanced compromises of Languedoc. His faith was not a passive belief but a militant creed, and his ambition, though veiled in religious rhetoric, burned with a fierce intensity. The terms of his election were stark. He was granted direct lordship over all the lands he could conquer from the heretics and their protectors. This was not a temporary military command. It was a permanent transfer of power, making Simon the new Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. In that moment, the crusade transformed. It was no longer just a spiritual purge. It became a personal project, a holy war for a new kingdom, and Simon de Montfort was its divinely anointed king. How would a man who saw heresy in every shadow and treachery in every negotiation govern a land built on tolerance and complex alliances? He would soon reveal an iron will, a determination to crush not only the Cathar faith, but the entire southern way of life that had allowed it to flourish. For the people of Occitania, the abstract threat of a crusade now had a name, a face, and a ruthless, unwavering purpose. Simon de Montfort's new kingdom was a fragile thing, a patchwork of conquered towns surrounded by a sea of simmering resentment. It did not take long for the southern lords to realize they faced not just a passing army, but a permanent occupation. In the autumn of 1211, a powerful coalition finally moved to crush the invader. Count Raymond of Toulouse, humiliated and enraged, joined forces with other great nobles and marched to the town of Castelnau, where Montfort was stationed with only a small garrison. The southern army was vast, its numbers dwarfing the Crusader force trapped within the town's modest walls. For the first time, Montfort was not the hunter, but the prey, cornered and seemingly doomed. The southern lords settled in for a siege, confident that starvation or a direct assault would deliver them their hated rival. They could taste victory. But Simon de Montfort was at his most dangerous when he was cornered. He understood that his only advantage lay in the psychology of his enemies. He knew the Southern coalition was a fragile alliance of proud, independent lords, each with their own agenda and a deep-seated reluctance to sacrifice their own men in a bloody frontal attack. So he decided to gamble everything on a single, breathtaking act of theater. He ordered the gates of Castelnau thrown open and led a small band of his best knights out in a furious, seemingly suicidal charge. This was not a genuine attempt to break the siege. It was a feint, a performance of insane bravery designed to look like the desperate lunge of a man with nothing left to lose. The sight of Montfort himself charging directly at them caused instant confusion and then panic in the southern ranks. Instead of holding their ground and engulfing the small sortie, whole sections of the besieging army wavered and then began to retreat, each lord suspecting the other of failing to support him. In the chaos, Montfort and his knights simply wheeled around and rode back inside the town, bolting the gates behind them. The southern army, shaken and disorganized, lost its nerve entirely and lifted the siege. The battle, or rather the non-battle, of Castelnau was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It cemented Simon de Montfort's legend as a commander of uncanny boldness and luck, a man who could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat through sheer force of will. More importantly, it exposed a fatal weakness in the southern cause. The lords of Occitania had the numbers and the opportunity to win, but they lacked the unified command, the shared resolve, and the ruthless desperation of their northern foe. They were a coalition, not an army. How many more chances would they let slip through their fingers because they could not act as one? While Simon de Montfort solidified his hold on the Trinqueval lands, the spiritual war against the South's greatest lord was escalating in a different arena. The church convened a formal council at the town of St. Gilles, a stage set not for battle, but for a different kind of execution. The defendant was Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, and the charge was nothing less than the spiritual treason of all Christendom. The proceedings were a meticulously orchestrated legal drama. One by one, the papal legates laid out their indictment against Raymond. They accused him of the most grievous sins imaginable. He was charged with the crime of heresy itself, of not merely tolerating the Cathar faith, but of secretly sympathizing with its doctrines. He was condemned for protecting known heretics within his court and across his domains, for shielding them from the church's justice. And most damning of all, he was formally accused of complicity in the murder of the papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau. In the eyes of the council, Raymond was not just a flawed political leader. He was a spiritual poison, a man whose very presence corrupted the land. The verdict was never in doubt. The council pronounced the ultimate sentence, excommunicating Count Raymond VI for a second and final time. This was more than a repetition of an old censure. It was a definitive, public casting out, a declaration that he was beyond redemption and outside the protection of God's law. This religious condemnation was the key that unlocked a new phase of the war. With Raymond officially branded a heretic and an enemy of the church, the crusade gained the legal and moral authority to move directly against him. Simon de Montfort was no longer just a conqueror seizing lands from a disgraced minor viscount. He was now the sword of the church, authorized to strip the most powerful prince in the south of his titles and his territories. The conflict instantly transformed. It was no longer a targeted campaign against the Cathar sect. It had become a full-scale war for the entire Languedoc, a holy war for territorial control disguised as a spiritual purge. The true prize was no longer just the rugged hills of the Trinqueval lands, but the rich, sprawling county of Toulouse itself. How would a count with everything to lose, finally cornered and condemned, fight for his ancestral home? High on a rocky spur above the river Cesse, the fortress of Minerve seemed to defy the very laws of nature. It was a natural citadel, protected by deep ravines on three sides and connected to the surrounding plateau only by a narrow, easily defended land bridge. For the Cathar perfecti and their defenders who crowded inside its walls, it was more than a castle. It was a sanctuary, a symbol of their faith's resilience. They believed it was untouchable. Simon de Montfort saw it as a problem to be solved with engineering and terror. In the blistering summer of 1210, his army arrived and set up camp, not for a direct assault, but for a methodical siege. His master of siege engines, a man whose name is lost to history, but whose work became legendary, directed the construction of enormous trebuchets. These were not simple catapults. They were complex machines of war, capable of hurling massive stones with devastating force and accuracy. The largest of them was given a name that spread fear through the defenders watching from the walls: Malvoisin, bad neighbor. Day and night, the great engine launched its deadly greetings, systematically pounding Minerve's fortifications and its morale. Yet the true masterstroke was not the destruction of the walls, but the targeting of the town's single, fragile lifeline. The people of Minerve relied on a single, deep well outside the main walls for all their water. Montfort's engineers turned Malvoisin against this vital point. They launched not just stone, but the carcasses of dead animals and barrels of filth, poisoning the water source. Under the relentless sun, with their defenses crumbling and their thirst becoming unbearable, the defenders had no choice. They surrendered. The terms offered were starkly simple. Anyone who renounced the Cathar faith and returned to the Catholic Church would be spared. Those who refused would face the consequences. When the time came, around 140 of the Cathar spiritual elite, the perfecti, made their choice. They would not convert. They were led to a field just outside the town, where a great pyre had been built. Without protest, they walked into the flames. This was not a chaotic massacre like Béziers. It was a formal, almost ceremonial execution, a chilling display of the crusaders' legalistic brutality and the perfecti's absolute commitment. The fire at Minerve sent a new, more refined message across Occitania. The crusaders could be patient. They could use science and starvation as their weapons. And for those who held to the Cathar faith, there would be no compromise, only the choice between betrayal and a martyr's death. How many other strongholds, watching from their own mountain perches, would now calculate the cost of their defiance? The fortress of Lavore stood as a beacon of defiance, a city castle whose lord and lady openly championed the Cathar cause. For Simon de Montfort, it was an insult that could not be tolerated, a stubborn thorn in the side of his new holy kingdom. In the spring of 1211, his army surrounded its walls, and the siege that followed became a byword for the Crusade's calculated savagery. For 2 months, the defenders held out, hoping for a relief force that never came. Montfort's engineers, veterans of Minerve, pounded the walls relentlessly until a section finally crumbled. His soldiers poured through the breach, and the city's fate was sealed in blood and fire. The first to die was the castle's ruler, the Lady Geraude de Lavore. Montfort's justice for a woman who had dared to defy him was both public and grotesquely symbolic. She was dragged to the edge of a deep well and thrown in, after which the crusaders hurled stones down upon her until she was buried in the pit. It was a death meant to erase her, to literally cast her down and cover her up, a chilling message to any noble woman considering resistance. The slaughter did not end there. The 80 knights who had formed the garrison were captured and condemned to the gallows. A single gibbet was built, a structure so flimsy that it collapsed under the weight of the first men hanged, crushing them beneath the timber and their falling comrades. The crusaders, unmoved, simply drew their swords and cut down the survivors where they stood. But the day's most horrific spectacle was reserved for the spiritual heart of Lavore. In a field outside the smoldering town, a massive pyre was constructed. Upon it, an estimated 400 Cathar perfecti, men and women who had refused to renounce their faith, were burned alive. The scale of the fire was unprecedented, a column of smoke and flame visible for miles, a deliberate act of psychological warfare meant to scorch the very soul of the region. The fall of Lavore was not just another military victory. It was a systematic demonstration. Following the pattern set at Minerve, Montfort was methodically eliminating the key strongholds that gave the Cathar faith physical sanctuary. But at Lavore, he escalated the violence to a new, terrifying level. The message was no longer just about religious purity, but about the total annihilation of any form of opposition, military, noble, or spiritual. Could any community, after seeing what happened to Lavore, still believe that defiance was a viable option? The walls of Toulouse rose like a mountain range of stone and defiance. This was not a remote fortress like Minerve or a defiant castle like Lavore. It was the greatest city of the Languedoc, a sprawling metropolis whose citizens were fiercely loyal to their count and their way of life. When Simon de Montfort's army arrived in the summer of 1211, they were not facing a garrison of knights, but an entire population united in resistance. Every man, woman, and child who could lift a stone or pour boiling oil became a defender. The city's fortifications were immense, a double ring of high walls and deep moats that had been strengthened for generations. Montfort, fresh from his string of terrifying victories, quickly realized he had met his match. His siege engines, so effective against smaller castles, made little impression on Toulouse's colossal ramparts. His attempts to storm the walls were met with a hailstorm of projectiles and a wall of determined citizens fighting for their homes. For 6 frustrating weeks, the Crusader army was stymied. They could not break in, and the Toulousains, supplied by the river and their own vast stores, showed no signs of breaking. Morale within Montfort's camp began to fray. His knights, who had grown accustomed to easy plunder and quick surrenders, grew restless and mutinous in the face of such stubborn, unified opposition. The siege became a costly stalemate, bleeding his treasury and his reputation. Finally, with no prospect of victory and his forces melting away, Simon de Montfort was forced to give the order he had never before uttered. He broke camp and retreated. The sight of the Crusader army marching away from Toulouse was a thunderclap of hope across southern France. For the first time, the seemingly invincible northern war machine had been stopped, and not by an army of lords, but by the sheer will of a city's people. The myth of Montfort's inevitability was shattered. If Toulouse could hold, then so could others. This first failure was a critical check on the Crusade's momentum, proving that unity and determination could form a shield even the most fervent holy warrior could not pierce. But how would a man like Simon de Montfort, his ambition wounded and his holy mission challenged, respond to such a public humiliation? The retreat from Toulouse was a temporary setback, not a surrender. Simon de Montfort had been bloodied, but his ambition and his army remained intact, waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment would arrive not from the north, but from across the Pyrenees, as a new and far more powerful player entered the game. For years, King Peter II of Aragon had watched the crusade with growing alarm. He was no friend to heresy. A crowned Catholic monarch, hailed as a hero for his victories against Muslims in Spain. But the northern invasion threatened his own interests. As the overlord of several territories in the Languedoc and the brother-in-law of the beleaguered Count Raymond of Toulouse, Peter saw Simon de Montfort not as a holy warrior, but as a dangerous rival, carving a new kingdom on his very border. The time for cautious diplomacy was over. In September of 1213, King Peter made his move, marching a powerful army of Aragonese and Catalan knights north to join forces with his brother-in-law. Their combined host, a glittering assembly of southern chivalry, descended upon the small town of Muret, which was held by a Crusader garrison. Their plan was simple: to draw Montfort into a trap and crush him. And Simon de Montfort, never one to refuse a fight, rushed to Muret with a force less than a third the size of the allied army. He was hopelessly outnumbered, facing the combined might of a king and a count. The stage was set for a single, decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of the entire South. The morning of the battle dawned with the Allied commanders confident of an easy victory. King Peter, perhaps underestimating the man he faced, did not even bother to wear his full royal armor. The southern forces were arrayed in a sprawling, disorganized camp, with the Aragonese knights separated from the Toulousain militia. They expected a long, formal siege, not an immediate attack. Simon de Montfort saw their complacency and seized his one chance. Instead of waiting to be besieged, he led his entire cavalry force out of the gates of Muret in a single, thunderous charge. He did not waste his energy on the Toulousain militia. He aimed his knights like a spear directly at the heart of the enemy, the Aragonese camp where King Peter himself was stationed. The result was not a battle, but a rout. The Aragonese knights, caught completely by surprise and unprepared for a disciplined charge, were shattered. In the chaotic melee, King Peter II of Aragon, one of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom, was pulled from his horse and killed. The news of his death spread through the allied army like a shockwave. Without their king, the Aragonese fled the field, and the Toulousain forces, seeing their allies break, lost all heart and scattered. In less than an hour, the Crusaders had won an impossible victory. The consequences of Muret were catastrophic for the southern cause. With King Peter dead, his vast alliance crumbled. Aragon withdrew from the conflict, its attention turning inward to a succession crisis. Count Raymond of Toulouse had lost his most powerful protector, the one man who could have matched Montfort's military power with royal authority. Simon de Montfort was now the undisputed master of the Languedoc. There was no one left to challenge him. The fate of the entire region, its culture, its independence, and its faith appeared to be sealed. The crusade, which had so recently faltered at the walls of Toulouse, was now triumphant. But can a land truly be conquered when its people's spirit remains unbroken? Far from the battlefields of Languedoc, in the echoing halls of Rome, the final act of the crusade was being written not with swords, but with legal decrees. The Fourth Lateran Council convened in 1215, a gathering of the most powerful churchmen in the world, and the fate of southern France was high on their agenda. This was the moment for the Church to put its official seal on the conquest, to transform a brutal military campaign into a legitimate, God-ordained transfer of power. The council served as the Supreme Court of Christendom, and the case against Count Raymond VI was presented as a foregone conclusion. He was the excommunicated protector of heretics, a man judged in absentia and found guilty of betraying the faith. With solemn ceremony, the council fathers pronounced their verdict. They formally stripped Raymond of all his lands and titles, dissolving his right to rule the county his family had held for generations. Then, in a move that shocked even some contemporaries, they invested Simon de Montfort as the new Count of Toulouse and Duke of Narbonne. This was more than a reward for a loyal general. It was an unprecedented act of political engineering. The Church had effectively anointed a new royal family for the South, a dynasty built entirely on holy war. With the stroke of a pen and the authority of a pope, Simon de Montfort's violent land grab was laundered into legal ownership. He was no longer a crusader baron, but a sovereign prince, his title recognized and blessed by the highest power in Europe. To the outside world, the Albigensian Crusade was over. The heresy had been crushed, its protectors dispossessed, and a pious new ruler installed. The official documents declared a successful conclusion. But parchment and reality are two different things. This grand legal triumph ignored the simple, stubborn truth on the ground. The people of Toulouse had not surrendered. The spirit of the South had not been broken. They had seen their count unjustly stripped of his birthright by a distant council, and their homeland handed to a foreign invader. How long could a victory declared in Rome hold against the simmering resentment of an entire population who refused to accept their new king? The legal victory in Rome meant nothing to the people of Toulouse. For 3 long years, they endured the rule of a man they saw as a foreign tyrant, and their resentment only hardened into a cold, determined resolve. In 1218, the city exploded in open rebellion, casting out Simon de Montfort's garrison and reclaiming their freedom. They knew he would be back. And he was. Montfort returned to the walls that had humiliated him once before, his army laying a second, even more determined siege upon the great city. But Toulouse was ready. Every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest artisan, became a soldier in a people's war. They rebuilt their defenses by day and launched daring raids by night, their knowledge of the city's every alley, and Sewer giving them an advantage no foreign army could match. The siege dragged on for 9 grueling months, a brutal war of attrition fought street by street, wall by wall. The Crusaders were slowly bleeding themselves dry against the unyielding spirit of the Toulousains. Then, on a day like any other, a single random event changed everything. Simon de Montfort was hearing Mass in a makeshift chapel when he was called to the front lines to direct an assault. As he stood in his armor, surveying the defiant city, A stone was launched from a mangonel operated not by trained engineers, but by the women and citizens of Toulouse. The shot was a miracle of luck and hatred. It flew true, striking the Crusader leader squarely on the head. The man who had seemed invincible, who had survived countless battles and forged a kingdom through sheer force of will, fell dead in an instant. The shockwave was immediate and catastrophic. Within the Crusader camp, disbelief turned to panic. Their leader, their cause, their very identity was gone. The heart of the Holy War had stopped beating. For the people of Toulouse, the news sparked an explosion of euphoric relief. Bells rang out from the city's towers, not in alarm, but in triumph. The siege was broken within days, the leaderless Crusader army retreating in disarray. Simon de Montfort's death was far more than the loss of a general. It was the moment the tide of the war irrevocably turned. The seemingly unstoppable northern conquest had reached its high water mark and now began to recede, leaving behind a power vacuum and a southern spirit reborn, more defiant than ever. A sudden power vacuum now yawned open where Simon de Montfort's iron will had once been. Leadership of the crusade fell to his son, Amory, but a title inherited is not the same as authority earned. Amory de Montfort lacked his father's ruthless genius, his magnetic command, his almost supernatural aura of inevitability. He was a competent soldier, but he was not the fearsome architect of a holy kingdom. He was merely its caretaker, and the foundation was cracking. Into this weakness flowed a resurgent southern spirit. The death of their great enemy was a clarion call. From exile, the old Count Raymond VI returned, his cause no longer just his own, but a popular uprising for the very soul of Occitania. Beside him was his son, the future Raymond VII, a young man embodying the energy and hope of a new generation. Together, they harnessed the widespread hatred for northern rule, transforming scattered grievances into a coordinated counter-offensive. One by one, the strongholds that Simon had conquered at such a terrible cost began to slip from Amory's grasp. Towns that had surrendered out of fear now rose up in rebellion, their gates opened not by siege engines, but by the people within. Castles garrisoned by northern knights were isolated and reclaimed. It was a slow, inexorable unraveling. Amory proved unable to stem the tide. He could win a skirmish, but he was losing the war for the loyalty of the land itself. The territories his father had carved out with fire and sword were melting away like snow in the southern sun, proving a brutal truth. The Northern Crusade had never been truly secure. It had always been a fragile empire, held together solely by the terrifying force of one man's personality. Without Simon de Montfort's iron fist, the entire structure was collapsing under the weight of its own illegitimacy. The crusade was failing on the ground, but what would the powers in Rome and Paris, who had invested so much in its success, do as they watched their holy project disintegrate? The collapse of Simon de Montfort's legacy demanded a new kind of power to salvage the crusade. Amory de Montfort, struggling to hold his father's crumbling conquests, turned to the one authority that could still command an army large enough to matter: the French crown. For years, King Philip Augustus had watched the conflict from a careful distance, wary of overcommitting his resources. But the Crusade's failure now threatened French prestige and created instability on his southern border. His answer was to send his son and heir, Prince Louis. The arrival of a royal prince in 1219 transformed the war once more. This was no longer just a baronial crusade. It was now an official campaign of the French monarchy. Prince Louis led a massive, well-supplied royal army south, a force intended not merely to support Amory, but to impose a final, kingly solution. His first target was the town of Marmande, a community that had thrown off its northern garrison. The siege was short, and the outcome horrifyingly familiar. When the town surrendered, the royal army, perhaps seeking to replicate the terror of Béziers, unleashed a massacre. Thousands of citizens, regardless of age, gender, or faith, were put to the sword in a brutal display meant to shock the South back into submission. The message was clear. The full weight of the French kingdom now stood behind the crusade. Flush with this grim victory, Prince Louis marched on the ultimate prize, Toulouse. He laid siege to the city, confident that his royal banner and fresh troops would succeed where Simon de Montfort had failed. But the people of Toulouse had already faced down one legend, and they were not intimidated by a prince. The city's defenses, hardened by years of conflict, held firm. Its citizens fought with the same desperate unity they had shown before. After 6 weeks of costly and fruitless assaults, Prince Louis was forced to admit defeat. He lifted the siege and marched his army home, his campaign a paradox of brutal power and ultimate failure. The intervention of the French crown had proven two things. It showed that the fate of the Languedoc was now a central concern of the Parisian monarchy, a matter of state that would not be abandoned. Yet it also demonstrated that even royal armies could not easily break the spirit of the South. The war had entered a prolonged and bloody stalemate, with neither side strong enough to win, but both too committed to surrender. How many more times would the fields of Occitania need to be soaked in blood before a different path could be found? 2 decades of fire finally burned down to cold political embers. In the year 1229, the war that had consumed a generation formally ended not with a final battle, but with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The document, also known as the Treaty of Meaux, was a monument to pure exhaustion. The southern resistance was spent, its lands ravaged and its people weary. The northern crusaders, despite their early triumphs, could no longer sustain the endless cycle of rebellion and reconquest. Everyone was tired of the bloodshed. The treaty's terms were a carefully crafted humiliation for the last Count of Toulouse, Raymond VII. On the surface, he was allowed to keep his title and his ancestral lands, a seeming victory for the southern cause. But the fine print told a different story, one of a brilliant dynastic trap set by the French crown. Raymond was forced to agree to a marriage between his sole heir, his young daughter Joan, and one of the brothers of the French king. This was the masterstroke. Since Raymond had no son, all his lands and titles would pass through his daughter directly into the hands of the French royal family upon his death. The independence of Toulouse, fought for so bitterly, was now on a guaranteed timer. The Count's personal penance was equally severe. He was compelled to lead a crusade to the Holy Land, to destroy the mighty fortifications of his own capital city, and to fund a new university in Toulouse, an institution designed to teach Orthodox Catholic doctrine. The treaty was a political surrender disguised as a negotiation. The French monarchy, which had intervened late in the conflict, emerged as the ultimate and only true victor. They had achieved through a marriage contract what decades of holy war could not: the peaceful, legal, and permanent absorption of the entire Languedoc into their kingdom. The crusade was over, but its final, most lasting conquest was not of a faith, but of a land. What kind of peace could possibly grow from such a poisoned seed? The peace treaty signed in Paris did not bring real peace. It brought a new kind of war. The open battlefields fell silent, but the conflict for the soul of the Languedoc simply moved into the shadows. Entire communities still held the old Cathar beliefs in secret, passing them from parent to child behind closed shutters. The Great Crusade had shattered the political structures of the South, but it had failed in its primary goal: to erase the heresy itself. The Church realized that castles and armies were useless against an enemy that was now a whispered faith in the human heart. To fight this invisible war, they forged a new and terrifying weapon: the Papal Inquisition. Formally established in 1233, this was not a temporary military campaign, but a permanent bureaucratic institution, a machine designed to hunt heresy with the cold precision of the law. Its agents were not knights in armor, but friars from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, men chosen for their education, their austerity, and their unwavering orthodoxy. They arrived in towns not with siege engines, but with ledgers and lists of questions. Their power was absolute. They could summon anyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest farmer, to answer for their beliefs. The Inquisitor's method was a slow, grinding process of investigation and interrogation. They would enter a town and announce a period of grace, calling on all who had strayed to come forward and confess. Those who confessed were given penance, which could be as light as a prayer or as severe as the lifelong wearing of a yellow cross sewn onto their clothing, a permanent mark of shame. But the real terror began after the grace period ended. The Inquisitors relied on a network of secret informants, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and even child against parent. Testimony was given in secret, and the accused were never told the names of their accusers. The goal was not just to punish individuals, but to map the entire social network of heresy, to uncover every perfectus, every believer, every sympathizer. A climate of profound fear settled over the region, a fear far more insidious than the brief, sharp terror of a crusader's charge. This was a war of suspicion, where a careless word over a meal or a forgotten prayer could lead to imprisonment, the seizure of property, or being handed over to the secular authorities for execution by fire. The age of the castle siege was over. The age of the interrogation room, with its quiet questions and meticulously kept records, had begun, and it would haunt the Languedoc for another 100 years. High on a jagged mountain peak in the Pyrenees, the fortress of Montségur became a beacon of final defiance. Long after the Treaty of Paris had supposedly ended the war, this remote castle evolved from a simple stronghold into the spiritual capital of the surviving Cathar faith. It was known as the synagogue of Satan to its enemies, but to the faithful, it was a sacred sanctuary. Here, high above the world of matter they so despised, the last of the Cathar perfecti gathered, along with their families and a garrison of dedicated knights. They lived in a small village clinging to the mountainside below the castle, a community devoted to prayer and study, believing themselves beyond the reach of any earthly power. The sheer cliffs and dizzying paths made the fortress seem untouchable, a symbol of a faith that refused to die. But the new political order, with the French crown now firmly in control of the Languedoc, could not tolerate this independent republic of heresy perched in its midst. The existence of Montségur was an open challenge, a stubborn reminder that the crusade had not achieved its ultimate goal. In the spring of 1243, the royal seneschal of Carcassonne received his orders. Montségur must be taken. A massive feudal army, no longer a crusading host but an official force of the French king, marched on the mountain. They set up camp far below, looking up at the seemingly impossible target. How do you lay siege to a cloud? The commander of the royal forces knew a direct assault was suicide. His only hope was to starve the defenders out. For 10 long months, his soldiers and local laborers toiled, building a road up the treacherous slopes and positioning siege engines on neighboring spurs to hurl stones at the castle walls. Inside Montségur, life became a grim vigil of dwindling supplies and bitter cold. Yet the community endured, their belief hardening with each passing day. They were no longer fighting for victory, but for the soul of their faith itself. The siege of Montségur was a slow, grinding process, a test of endurance between an unstoppable state power and an immovable spiritual resolve. The world watched and waited for the inevitable, tragic end. The royal army's siege of Montségur was a battle against the mountain itself. For 10 long months, the king's men toiled on the impossible slopes, their efforts a testament to the state's grim determination. Engineers and conscripted laborers cut a winding road up the cliff face, a grueling project that allowed them to haul massive siege engines and supplies to positions once thought unreachable. From these newly built platforms, trebuchets launched their stone ammunition in a constant, demoralizing barrage against the castle walls high above. Inside the fortress, the defenders watched this slow, methodical advance with a sinking heart. Their greatest asset, the mountain's natural defense, was being systematically conquered by human ingenuity and relentless effort. The initial confidence that their sanctuary was untouchable began to erode as surely as the stonework under the relentless pounding. Life within the walls became a desperate struggle against starvation and the bitter cold of the Pyrenean winter. Food supplies, carefully hoarded, dwindled to almost nothing. The community of perfecti, knights, and their families endured on starvation rations, their bodies weakening as their spiritual resolve was put to the ultimate test. They were trapped in a stone nest, watching the hunters slowly, inexorably, climb closer. The suspense of those final weeks was a palpable weight. Every day, the defenders scanned the horizon for a relief force that would never come. Every night, they listened to the sounds of the enemy camp below, growing larger and more organized. They knew the royal army would not leave. They knew surrender was the only possible end. But more terrifying than surrender was the certain knowledge of what would follow. The Crusade's old, brutal choice was waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain. Renounce your faith or face the flames. How does a community prepare for such an ending, when every passing day brings them closer to a moment of ultimate, tragic decision? The final surrender of Montségur was negotiated in the cold air of early March. The terms offered by the royal commander were starkly simple, a grim echo of choices made at Minerve and Lavore decades before. The soldiers and laypeople in the fortress would be granted free passage and their lives. But for the more than 200 Cathar perfecti, the spiritual heart of the community, there was only one condition for survival. They must abjure their faith, renounce the beliefs that had defined their entire lives, and accept the Catholic Church. They were given a period of grace to consider this final, terrible choice. Not a single one of them accepted. Their decision was immediate and unanimous. They would not betray the path to salvation they had dedicated their lives to walking. On the 16th of March, a solemn procession descended the mountain paths they had defended for so long. More than 200 men and women, the last great assembly of the Cathar clergy, were escorted by their captors to a field far below the castle walls. There, the royal soldiers had prepared a horrific spectacle. A large palisade of sharpened stakes was erected and filled with dry wood and brush, creating a massive, enclosed pyre. The chroniclers tell us that the perfecti did not scream or beg for mercy. They walked willingly into the roaring flames, many of them singing hymns as the fire consumed them. This was not an execution forced upon a terrified mob. It was a mass martyrdom, a chillingly deliberate act of faith. The sheer scale of the event, over 200 people choosing a fiery death over spiritual betrayal, marked the definitive end of organized Catharism as a public force in the Languedoc. The fire at Montségur became one of the most enduring and powerful images of religious martyrdom in European history. A final, silent protest against a world that had tried for 40 years to erase them. How does a belief system truly die? It does not end with the fall of a castle, but only when the last person willing to die for it is gone. 11 years after the fire at Montségur, a single castle still held out against the New World Order. Perched on a razor-edged peak in the rugged Corbières Mountains, Quéribus was a fortress of last resort, a final, stubborn piece of the old Languedoc that refused to be fitted into the French king's map. Its garrison was a ghost of the former Cathar resistance, a mix of die-hard knights and the last few fugitive perfecti, who had somehow escaped the relentless hunt of the Inquisition. They were no longer an army, but a symbol. While Montségur had been the spiritual heart, its destruction a monumental martyrdom, Quéribus was the military appendix, the very last flicker of armed defiance. Its continued existence was a quiet, daily insult to the authorities who had proclaimed the crusade over and the heresy defeated. How could they claim total victory while this lone sentinel watched from its impossible perch, flying a banner for a lost cause? The end, when it came in 1255, was not the stuff of epic legend. There was no grand siege, no mass martyrdom. The French royal forces, now the permanent government of the region, simply applied the slow, grinding pressure of a state that had all the time in the world. They isolated the castle, cutting off its supply lines and patiently waiting. The garrison, hopelessly outnumbered and with no prospect of relief, finally negotiated a surrender. They walked out of the gates and into obscurity. The fall of Quéribus was an administrative formality, the closing of a file that had been left open for a decade. But its symbolic weight was immense. It marked the absolute, final end of armed Cathar resistance. The last ember of the once vibrant church was now cold. The war that had begun with the thunder of crusader armies was finished not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a key in a castle gate now held by the king's own seneschal. The landscape was at peace, but what had this long, drawn-out suppression truly accomplished, and what new world had been forged from the ashes of the old? The Crusade's silence left behind a permanently altered landscape. The vibrant, independent culture of Occitania, with its celebrated troubadours and tradition of courtly love, was systematically dismantled. The language of the South, Occitan, was suppressed in favor of the northern French dialect of the king's court, a linguistic shift that erased a cornerstone of southern identity. The political map of France was redrawn with brutal finality. The autonomous counties of the Languedoc were now direct possessions of the French crown. their powerful lords replaced by royal administrators. This was the true, lasting victory of the Crusade, not the eradication of a faith, but the centralization of a kingdom. The French monarchy emerged immeasurably stronger, its borders pushed to the Mediterranean, its internal rivals crushed under the banner of holy war. Yet this new unity was built upon a foundation of ash and grief. What does it cost a nation to forge itself in such a fire? For the people living in the region, the aftermath was a quiet catastrophe. The once prosperous towns and fertile fields had been ravaged by 20 years of relentless warfare. Trade routes were shattered, populations displaced, and local economies ruined for generations. The physical destruction was matched by a deeper, psychological scar, a culture of fear enforced by the ever-present Inquisition. This institution did not disband with the last Cathar fortress. It became a permanent feature of life, its methods of secret denunciation and public penance creating a society where trust was a luxury and old beliefs were whispered only in the deepest privacy. The Crusade had sought to purify the land, but it left behind a legacy of suspicion and trauma that would linger for centuries. The Albigensian Crusade stands as a dark, foundational chapter in the creation of modern France, and a sobering lesson in the lengths to which authority will go to eliminate dissent. It forces us to ask a difficult question: can a peace built upon the ruins of a culture ever truly be called a victory? From a single word to a mountain of flames, the Albigensian Crusade carved an epic and tragic arc across the heart of medieval Europe. It began as a call to purify the faith, a holy war sanctioned by a pope to eradicate a rival belief, yet it spiraled into a decades-long campaign of conquest, shattering a vibrant culture and forging a unified France from the ashes of its southern territories. This was a story of profound faith, both of the Cathar perfecti, who walked willingly into the fire, and of the Crusaders who believed they were serving God. It was a story of raw power, as northern barons and a patient French crown saw a golden opportunity to expand their domains. And it was a story of fanaticism, where the line between religious duty and brutal atrocity was blurred beyond recognition. The legacy of this conflict forces us to confront a difficult question that echoes down the centuries. Was this a holy war to save souls, or a brutal land grab disguised as piety? The answer may not be simple, and it may lie somewhere in the painful space between both ideas. As you reflect on this journey through 25 critical moments, we want to hear from you. Which moment did you find the most shocking or pivotal? Was it the chilling order at Béziers, the political trap of the Treaty of Paris, or the final, silent defiance at Montségur? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey into the mysteries of history captivated you, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten stories that shaped our